Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the small airfield, her heart racing as she watched the sleek aircraft taxi down the runway. At 22 years old, she had spent countless hours dreaming of this moment. But now that it was here, doubt crept into her mind like a cold morning fog. The year was 1978, and women in aviation were still a rare sight. Sarah had grown up in a small farming town in Kansas where her father worked as a crop duster. Every morning before school, she would sit on their porch and watch him take off in his yellow biplane, disappearing into the endless prairie sky. While other girls her age played with dolls and dreamed of becoming teachers or nurses, Sarah's imagination soared with the aircraft overhead. Her fascination with flying began when she was just 8 years old. Her father, Tom Mitchell, had taken her up in his crop duster for the first time. As they climbed higher and higher, Sarah pressed her face against the small window, watching the farmland below shrink into a patchwork quilt of green and gold. The sensation of defying gravity filled her with a joy she had never experienced before. "Daddy, I want to learn to fly," she had announced that evening at dinner, her voice filled with determination that surprised even herself. Her mother, Helen, nearly choked on her coffee. "Flying is no job for a woman, Sarah. It's dangerous and unpredictable. You should focus on more practical things." But Tom saw something special in his daughter's eyes that day. Over the years, he began teaching her the basics of aviation during their weekend flights. Sarah learned to read wind patterns, understand weather systems, and most importantly, she developed an intuitive feel for aircraft that impressed even her experienced father. By the time Sarah turned 18, she had logged more passenger hours than most people would in a lifetime. She knew every gauge, every control, and every sound of her father's plane by heart. Her bedroom walls were covered with aviation magazines, flight charts, and pictures of famous pilots. Amelia Earhart's photograph held the place of honor above her desk, serving as daily inspiration. Despite her mother's concerns and the skeptical looks from neighbors, Sarah saved every penny from her part-time job at the local diner to pay for flying lessons. The nearest flight school was 60 miles away in Wichita, but she made the drive twice a week without fail. Even during harsh winter storms, her flight instructor, Captain Roberts, was initially hesitant to take on a female student. He was a former military pilot who had seen action in Korea and believed that flying was a man's profession. However, Sarah's determination and natural aptitude quickly changed his mind. "I've never seen anyone pick up the fundamentals so quickly," he told her father during one of their meetings. "She has instincts that can't be taught." The girl was born to fly. Sarah's first solo flight came after just 15 hours of instruction, well below the national average. As she climbed into the cockpit of the small Cessna 150, her hands trembled slightly on the controls. Captain Roberts gave her final instructions through the radio, his voice crackling with static. "Remember, trust your training and trust yourself. You've got this, Sarah." The takeoff was smooth, and as Sarah gained altitude, all her fears melted away. She was alone in the sky, master of her own destiny, with nothing but blue sky and white clouds surrounding her. For 30 minutes, she practiced the maneuvers she had learned, each one executed with precision and confidence. Landing proved more challenging than expected. The crosswinds were stronger than usual, and Sarah had to make several adjustments to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway. Her heart pounded as the ground approached, but her training took over. The wheels touched down with barely a bump, and she taxied back to the hangar with a smile that could have lit up the entire airfield. Word of Sarah's flying abilities spread quickly through the small aviation community in Kansas. Some pilots were impressed by her skills, but many others viewed her as an oddity, a young woman trying to enter a man's world. The comments ranged from patronizing encouragement to outright hostility. "It's cute that she wants to play pilot," she overheard one veteran aviator saying to another. "But when the weather gets rough or there's a real emergency, she'll realize this isn't a game." These comments only fueled Sarah's determination. She began studying aviation textbooks late into the night, memorizing emergency procedures and weather patterns. She practiced instrument flying until she could navigate by instruments alone, even in zero visibility conditions. Her father watched her progress with a mixture of pride and worry. He knew how difficult it would be for her to find work as a pilot, especially in commercial aviation. The major airlines had never hired a female pilot, and even smaller charter companies were reluctant to take the risk. "Sarah, you know I believe in you," Tom said one evening as they worked together in the hangar. But the aviation world is tough even for experienced men. Are you sure you want to face all those challenges? Sarah looked up from the engine she was inspecting. Her face smudged with grease, but her eyes bright with determination. Dad, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I know it won't be easy, but I have to try. If I don't chase this dream, I'll regret it forever. By her 21st birthday, Sarah had earned her private pilot license, instrument rating, and commercial license. She had logged over 500 hours of flight time and could handle aircraft in conditions that challenged pilots with twice her experience. Yet despite her qualifications, finding employment proved nearly impossible. She applied to dozens of airlines, charter companies, and cargo services, only to receive polite rejection letters or, more often, no response at all. The few interviews she managed to secure ended quickly once the employers realized she was a woman. "We're just not ready for female pilots," was the most common explanation. "Our insurance won't cover it," was another frequent excuse, but Sarah refused to give up. She knew that somewhere out there was an opportunity waiting for her, a chance to prove that skill and determination mattered more than gender. She just had to find it. As she stood on the airfield that morning, watching the aircraft prepare for takeoff, Sarah clutched a telegram in her hand. It was from a small charter company in Colorado that specialized in mountain flying. They needed a pilot immediately for a dangerous rescue mission in the Rocky Mountains. Every male pilot they had contacted had turned down the job, claiming it was too risky. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the familiar mixture of excitement and nervousness that always preceded a new challenge. This was her chance to prove herself, to show the world that she belonged in the sky just as much as any man. The charter company office in Denver was smaller than Sarah had expected, tucked between an auto repair shop and a diner near the airport. The building looked like it had seen better days, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that read, "Mountain Air Charter Service." Sarah pushed through the glass door, the bell above jingling to announce her arrival. Behind the counter sat a gruff-looking man in his 50s, his weathered face showing years of exposure to high-altitude sun and wind. His name tag read Bill Harrison, owner. He looked up from his paperwork as Sarah approached, his expression changing from hope to disappointment in an instant. "You hear about the secretary job?" he asked, not bothering to hide his assumption. "No, sir, I'm Sarah Mitchell. I'm here about the pilot position. We spoke on the phone yesterday." Bill's eyebrows shot up and he leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "You're the pilot from Kansas? The one with all those flying hours?" "Yes, sir, that's me." Sarah placed her logbook and certificates on the counter with confidence. Despite her racing heart, Bill picked up her logbook and began flipping through the pages, his expression growing more serious with each entry. Sarah had meticulously documented every flight, every condition she had flown in, and every type of aircraft she had piloted. The numbers spoke for themselves, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. "Listen, Sarah," Bill said, setting down the logbook. "This isn't crop dusting in Kansas. Mountain flying is the most dangerous type of aviation there is. The weather changes in minutes, the terrain is unforgiving, and there's no room for mistakes. One wrong decision and you're scattered across a mountainside." Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked him directly in the eye. "Mr. Harrison, I understand the risks. I've studied mountain flying techniques extensively, and I've practiced high-altitude operations. I know about density altitude, mountain wave turbulence, and downdrafts. More importantly, I'm not afraid of the challenge." Bill rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "The job that came up, it's a rescue mission. A geologist got stranded at a research station up near Mount Evans after an early blizzard hit. The weather cleared temporarily, but another storm system is moving in fast. The landing strip up there is basically a dirt road carved into the side of the mountain, and it's only accessible for maybe a 2-hour window before the weather closes in again." He paused, watching Sarah's reaction. "3 experienced pilots turned this job down already. Said it was suicide. The altitude is over 11,000 feet. The strip is only 800 feet long, and if you miss your approach, there's no going around. You either land or you crash." Instead of fear, Sarah felt excitement building in her chest. This was exactly the kind of challenge she had been preparing for her entire life. "What kind of aircraft?" "A Piper Super Cub modified for high-altitude work. It's got extra power and modified wings for better performance in thin air, but it's still going to be tricky." Sarah had never flown a Super Cub, but she had studied its specifications and knew its capabilities. It was perfect for short field operations and could handle rough strips that would destroy larger aircraft. When do we need to leave? Bill stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. You're serious about this, aren't you? Even knowing you could die up there? Mr. Harrison, there's a man stranded on that mountain who needs help. If I can get him out safely, then that's what I'm going to do. That's what pilots are supposed to do. The conviction in Sarah's voice seemed to impress Bill. He walked over to a large map on the wall showing the Colorado mountains, marked with various airstrips and obstacles. All right, here's the situation. The research station is here. He pointed to a spot high in the mountains. The strip runs east to west along this ridge. You'll be landing uphill, which is good for stopping, but takeoff will be downhill with a cliff at the end. Sarah studied the map carefully, memorizing every detail. What's the weight limit? The geologist weighs about 180 pounds, plus his equipment and samples. That puts us right at the edge of the aircraft's performance envelope at that altitude. There won't be much margin for error. Weather forecast. Current ceiling is 12,000 feet with light winds. But there's a front moving in from the west that will drop the ceiling to about 8,000 feet by this afternoon. After that, it's snow and high winds for the next 3 days minimum. Sarah nodded, calculating the timeline in her head. They would need to leave within the hour to have enough time for the round trip before the weather deteriorated. I'll need some time to familiarize myself with the Super Cub. Bill led her outside to where the aircraft was parked. It was smaller than she had expected, painted bright orange for visibility against the mountain terrain. The modifications were immediately apparent. Larger tires for rough field operations, extended wing tips for better lift, and additional radio equipment for mountain communications. She's temperamental but reliable, Bill explained as Sarah conducted her pre-flight inspection. The engine runs rich at altitude, so you'll need to lean the mixture carefully. The controls are very sensitive, especially in the thin air up there. Sarah climbed into the cockpit and immediately felt at home. The instrument panel was similar to aircraft she had flown before, though some of the gauges were specifically calibrated for high-altitude operations. She spent 20 minutes familiarizing herself with every control, every switch, and every indicator. The radio frequencies for the research station are preset on Channel 3, Bill explained. The geologist's name is Dr. Marcus Webb. He's been up there for 2 weeks conducting geological surveys when the weather caught him. As Sarah started the engine, she noticed several other pilots had gathered near the hangar to watch. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to skepticism, and she could hear fragments of their conversations carried on the wind. Crazy sending a woman up there. She's going to get herself killed. Mountain flying isn't for beginners. Sarah ignored the comments and focused on her engine run-up procedures. Everything checked out perfectly. The Super Cub might be small and temperamental, but it was in excellent mechanical condition. Bill climbed into the passenger seat, surprising Sarah. You didn't think I was going to let you go alone, did you? This is my aircraft and Dr. Webb is my client. Besides, you'll need someone to help with the loading. As they taxied toward the runway, Sarah felt the familiar calm that always settled over her before a challenging flight. This was what she had trained for, what she had dreamed about during all those long nights studying aviation manuals and weather reports. The takeoff from Denver was smooth, and as they climbed toward the mountains, Sarah marveled at the spectacular scenery. The Rocky Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the morning sun. But she knew that beneath their beauty lay deadly dangers, unpredictable weather, treacherous downdrafts, and terrain that offered no forgiveness for pilot error. At 9,000 feet, they encountered their first mountain wave turbulence. The Super Cub bucked and rolled as invisible waves of air cascaded down the mountainsides. Sarah's hands remained steady on the controls, making small corrections to maintain their heading and altitude. Nice flying, Bill commented, his initial skepticism beginning to fade. You handled turbulence better than most pilots I've flown with. Ahead of them, the weather was starting to change. What had been clear blue sky an hour earlier now showed the first signs of the approaching front, wispy clouds forming along the ridgelines and a slight haze beginning to build in the distance. Time was running short, and the real challenge was still ahead of them. As the Super Cub climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah felt the aircraft's performance change dramatically. At 11,000 feet, the air was so thin that every control input had to be more deliberate. more precise. The engine worked harder to maintain power, and the wings needed more speed to generate the same amount of lift they produced at sea level. There's the research station. Bill pointed ahead to a small cluster of buildings perched on what looked like an impossible ledge carved into the mountainside. And there's our landing strip. Sarah squinted through the windscreen and felt her heart skip a beat. What Bill generously called a landing strip looked more like a dirt path that someone had carved along the ridge. It was shorter than he had described, probably closer to 700 feet, and it ended abruptly where the mountain dropped away into a valley thousands of feet below. Radio contact should work now, Bill said, switching to the preset frequency. Research Station Alpha, this is Mountain Air Charter. Do you copy? Static crackled through their headphones for several seconds before a voice responded. Mountain Air Charter, this is Dr. Webb at Research Station Alpha. Thank God you're here. The weather's starting to deteriorate rapidly up here. Sarah looked around and confirmed what Dr. Webb was saying. Clouds were building along the western peaks and the wind was starting to shift. They had maybe 90 minutes before the weather would make flying impossible. Dr. Webb, this is Sarah Mitchell, your pilot today. What's your current situation? There was a pause before Dr. Webb responded, and Sarah could hear the surprise in his voice. Did you say Sarah? As in a female pilot? That's correct. Are you ready for immediate pickup? Another pause. Look, no offense, but are you sure you can handle this landing? This isn't exactly a normal airport up here. Bill grabbed the microphone, his face flushed with annoyance. Dr. Webb, Sarah is a highly qualified pilot with extensive mountain flying experience. She's here to get you out safely. Sarah appreciated Bill's support, but she had heard this kind of doubt before. Dr. Webb, I understand your concerns, but I need you to focus on being ready for departure. How much equipment do you need to bring? About 60 pounds of rock samples and instruments. They're essential for my research. Sarah did quick weight and balance calculations in her head. With Dr. Webb, his equipment, fuel, and the two of them already on board, they would be very close to the aircraft's maximum weight limit. Every pound would matter at this altitude. Understood. Have everything ready at the airstrip. We'll need to load quickly and depart immediately. As they approached the research station, Sarah began her descent, studying the terrain carefully. The landing strip was even more challenging than it had appeared from a distance. It sloped upward from east to west, which would help with stopping, but the approach would require flying between two rocky ridges with very little margin for error. Standard approach won't work here, Sarah muttered, more to herself than to Bill. What do you mean? Look at the terrain. If I come in at a normal approach angle, we'll hit that ridge on the left. I need to come in steeper and slower than normal. Sarah began setting up for what pilots call a short field approach, a steep descent at minimum safe airspeed that would allow them to clear the obstacles and touch down as early as possible on the short strip. It was one of the most demanding maneuvers in aviation, requiring perfect timing and control. Are you sure about this? Bill asked, his knuckles white as he gripped the door handle. Trust me, Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. She reduced power and lowered the flaps, feeling the Super Cub slow to just above stalling speed. The aircraft felt mushy in the thin air, requiring larger control inputs to maintain proper attitude. She aimed for a spot about 50 feet past the beginning of the strip, knowing she would need every available foot to stop before the cliff at the far end. The approach was perfect until they hit the mountain wave turbulence coming off the ridge. Suddenly, the Super Cub was caught in a violent downdraft that threatened to slam them into the mountainside. Sarah immediately added power and pulled back on the stick, fighting to maintain control as the aircraft bucked and rolled in the invisible tornado of air. Pull up, Bill shouted, but Sarah was already ahead of him. Instead of aborting the approach, Sarah used her knowledge of mountain flying to work with the turbulence rather than against it. She recognized the pattern of the downdraft and knew that just ahead, there would be an updraft on the other side of the ridge. She held the aircraft in the downdraft just long enough to position them correctly, then used the updraft to balloon over the ridge and onto the landing strip. The touchdown was firm but controlled, and Sarah immediately applied maximum braking while pulling back on the stick to keep the tail down. The Super Cub rolled up the sloping strip using gravity to help slow the aircraft. They stopped with less than 100 feet to spare. Jesus Christ, Bill breathed, releasing his death grip on the door handle. I've never seen flying like that. Dr. Webb was waiting for them at a small building near the airstrip, along with his equipment cases. He was a tall, thin man in his 40s, wearing a heavy winter coat and looking somewhat skeptical as he watched Sarah shut down the engine. "You're the pilot?" he asked as Sarah climbed out of the cockpit. "Yes, sir, Sarah Mitchell. We need to load quickly and get out of here. The weather's closing in fast." Dr. Webb looked at the young woman in front of him, then at the steep, dangerous airstrip, then back at Sarah. "No offense, but I was expecting someone with more experience. This is a very dangerous situation." Sarah was loading his equipment cases into the aircraft's cargo compartment, checking the weight distribution carefully. "Dr. Webb, I have over 800 hours of flight time, including extensive mountain flying experience. More importantly, I just successfully landed on your impossible airstrip in deteriorating weather conditions. I suggest we focus on getting you home safely, rather than debating my qualifications." The firmness in her voice seemed to convince him. Dr. Webb climbed into the back seat while Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection. The wind was picking up and she could see snow beginning to fall on the higher peaks to the west. "Takeoff is going to be interesting," she told Bill as they strapped in. "We'll be heavy. The altitude reduces our engine power and we're taking off downhill toward that cliff. Can we make it?" Sarah had already calculated the takeoff performance in her head. They would need every foot of the strip and perfect technique to get airborne before reaching the cliff. "We'll make it," she said with more confidence than she felt. She started the engine and taxied to the very beginning of the strip, using every available foot. After a final engine run-up to ensure maximum power, she released the brakes and began the takeoff roll. The Super Cub accelerated slowly in the thin air, much slower than Sarah was accustomed to at lower altitudes. Halfway down the strip, they still weren't at flying speed. 3/4 of the way, the airspeed indicator finally reached takeoff speed. But Sarah held the aircraft on the ground, letting it accelerate further. As the end of the strip rushed toward them, Sarah gently pulled back on the stick. The Super Cub lifted off just as the ground disappeared beneath them, dropping away into the valley thousands of feet below. "Holy hell," Dr. Webb whispered from the back seat, finally understanding the skill required to execute such a takeoff. But Sarah's work wasn't finished yet. They still had to navigate through deteriorating weather conditions to get back to Denver safely. As they climbed away from the research station, she could see the storm front advancing much faster than the weather forecast had predicted. They were racing against time, and the mountains were not going to make it easy for them. The weather deteriorated faster than anyone had predicted. What should have been a routine flight back to Denver was turning into a race against one of the most dangerous mountain storms Sarah had ever encountered. Dark clouds were building rapidly around the peaks, and the wind was shifting from multiple directions, creating treacherous turbulence that made the Super Cub feel like a toy in a hurricane. "We need to find a different route," Sarah announced, studying the weather patterns ahead. The normal path back to Denver was completely blocked by a wall of storms that stretched from north to south across the Front Range. "What do you mean, different route?" Dr. Webb asked nervously from the back seat. "Isn't there only one way out of here?" Bill was studying the sectional chart, his finger tracing various mountain passes and valleys. "There's a route through Rabbit Ears Pass, but it's complicated. We'd have to fly through some of the most dangerous terrain in Colorado." Sarah was already calculating the alternatives in her head. Rabbit Ears Pass would take them north before turning back east toward Denver, adding at least 40 minutes to their flight time. But it might be their only option if the storms continued building along their direct route. "What's the minimum safe altitude through Rabbit Ears?" she asked Bill. 12,000 feet minimum, but with this turbulence you'd want to be higher, maybe 13 or 14,000. Sarah checked their current altitude, 11,800 feet, and their engine performance. The Super Cub was already working hard in the thin air, and climbing another 2,000 feet would push both the aircraft and engine close to their limits. "We can do it," she decided, "but it's going to be rough." As they turned north toward the alternate route, the first snowflakes began hitting their windscreen. Within minutes, what had started as light snow became a heavy squall that reduced visibility to less than a mile. Sarah switched to instrument flying, relying on her gauges rather than visual references to maintain control of the aircraft. "I can't see anything out there," Dr. Webb said, his voice tight with fear. "That's normal," Sarah replied calmly. "We're flying on instruments now. The important thing is to stay calm and trust the equipment." But privately, Sarah was concerned. Flying instruments in severe turbulence was challenging enough, but doing it in a light aircraft at high altitude over mountainous terrain was one of the most dangerous situations a pilot could face. Every gust of wind threatened to throw them off course, and the mountains below offered no safe landing options if something went wrong. The turbulence intensified as they entered the mountain pass. Invisible rivers of air cascaded down the rocky slopes, creating violent updrafts and downdrafts that tossed the Super Cub around like a leaf in a tornado. Sarah's hands moved constantly on the controls, making small corrections to keep them level and on course. "Altitude," Bill shouted as the aircraft suddenly dropped 500 feet in a massive downdraft. Sarah had already seen the altitude loss and was adding power, pulling back on the stick to arrest their descent. But in the thin air and heavy turbulence, the aircraft's response was sluggish. They dropped another 200 feet before she could stop the descent. "We're getting close to minimum safe altitude," she announced, studying the terrain chart. According to her calculations, they were now only 800 feet above the highest peaks in the pass. Another violent downdraft grabbed the Super Cub, and this time Sarah couldn't stop the descent quickly enough. The altimeter showed they had dropped below the minimum safe altitude for the pass, putting them dangerously close to the rocky peaks hidden in the clouds below. "Sarah, we need to turn around," Bill said urgently. "This is getting too dangerous." But turning around wasn't an option anymore. The storms had closed in behind them, trapping them in the mountain pass with no choice but to continue forward. Sarah increased power to maximum and began a shallow climb, fighting both the turbulence and the aircraft's reduced performance at altitude. "Come on," she whispered to the Super Cub, coaxing every bit of performance from the engine and airframe. Suddenly, Dr. Webb pointed out his window. "I can see the ground." "There's a peak right below us!" Sarah looked down and felt her heart stop. Through a brief break in the clouds, she could see a rocky mountainside less than 300 feet directly beneath them. They were far too low, flying through a pass that required precise navigation and perfect altitude control. Without hesitation, Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct for safe flying. Instead of trying to climb over the mountains, she descended even lower, following the natural contours of the valley floor. It was a technique called scud running that was considered extremely dangerous, but it was their only chance of getting through the pass alive. "What are you doing?" Bill asked, his voice cracking with stress. "Flying the terrain," Sarah replied, her eyes moving constantly between the instruments and the brief glimpses of ground visible through the swirling snow. "If we can't climb over it, we go around it." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah flew one of the most challenging flights of her career. She followed valleys and ridgelines, staying just high enough to clear obstacles while remaining below the worst of the turbulence. Every turn required split-second timing, and a single mistake would have been fatal. Dr. Webb sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that he was witnessing flying skills that few pilots possessed. This young woman who had looked so inexperienced was demonstrating a level of aviating that bordered on the supernatural. "There," Sarah pointed ahead through the windscreen. "I can see the end of the pass." The clouds were starting to break up as they emerged from the mountain pass, and the turbulence was beginning to decrease. But their troubles weren't over yet. The fuel gauge showed they had burned far more fuel than planned during their battle with the headwinds and turbulence. "How much fuel do we have left?" Bill asked, noticing Sarah's concerned expression. Sarah calculated quickly. "Maybe 40 minutes at normal cruise power. Denver is still 35 minutes away under normal conditions. What if we encounter more headwinds?" "Then we'll need to find an alternate airport," Sarah replied, already studying the chart for closer landing options. As they descended out of the mountains toward the Great Plains, the weather began to improve dramatically. The clouds started breaking up, visibility increased, and most importantly, the turbulence decreased to manageable levels. But the fuel situation remained critical. Sarah reduced power to the most efficient cruise setting and began a gentle descent that would allow them to reach Denver with minimal fuel consumption. Every decision now had to balance speed against fuel economy, altitude against wind conditions. "Denver approach control. This is Mountain Air Charter 847, Sarah called on the radio. "We're 20 miles southwest with a low fuel situation. Requesting priority handling for landing. Mountain Air Charter 847 Denver approach. Understand low fuel. You're cleared direct to runway 34 left. Maintain 7,000 feet. Report the airport in sight." As the Denver skyline came into view, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. They were going to make it. The fuel gauge was hovering just above empty, but they had enough to reach the airport safely. The landing was smooth and uneventful, a stark contrast to the harrowing mountain flight they had just completed. As Sarah taxied to the mountain air charter ramp, she noticed a small crowd gathered around the building. Word of their flight had apparently spread through the aviation community. When she shut down the engine, the silence seemed deafening after hours of engine noise and wind. Dr. Webb was the first to speak. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. When I saw you were a woman, I didn't think you could handle a flight like this. I was wrong. You're the finest pilot I've ever flown with." Bill nodded in agreement. "That was some of the best mountain flying I've ever seen. You saved all our lives up there." As they climbed out of the Super Cub, Sarah felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had proven to herself and to others that she belonged in the cockpit, regardless of what anyone might think about female pilots. But even as the other pilots gathered around to congratulate her on the successful rescue mission, Sarah could see doubt in some of their faces. One successful flight didn't change decades of prejudice and skepticism. She would have to prove herself again and again with every flight, every challenge, every opportunity. The real test was just beginning. Word of Sarah's mountain rescue spread through the aviation community faster than wildfire. Within a week, newspapers across Colorado were running stories about the young female pilot who had successfully completed a mission that several experienced male pilots had refused. The headlines ranged from respectful recognition to sensationalized accounts that focused more on her gender than her flying skills. "Female pilot saves stranded scientist," read the Denver Post. "Lady aviator conquers the Rockies," proclaimed a smaller paper. Sarah cringed at some of the coverage, particularly the articles that seemed surprised that a woman could fly an airplane competently. But the publicity also brought opportunities. Bill Harrison offered her a permanent position with Mountain Air Charter, making her the first female pilot employed by a commercial aviation company in Colorado. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady work doing what she loved most. "You've earned this," Bill told her as she signed the employment contract. "That rescue mission convinced me that skill matters more than gender. You're a natural mountain pilot." However, not everyone in the aviation community was pleased with Sarah's success. Many of the older pilots at Denver's airports viewed her as an unwelcome intruder in their masculine world. The comments ranged from subtle skepticism to outright hostility. "Women don't belong in cockpits," she overheard one veteran pilot telling another at the airport restaurant. "They're too emotional, can't handle stress like men can. That rescue was just beginner's luck. What happens when she's got her monthly problems and can't think straight?" Another added with a crude laugh. "You can't trust a woman with people's lives." Sarah tried to ignore such comments, but they stung nonetheless. Every flight became an opportunity for others to scrutinize her performance, looking for any sign of weakness or error that would confirm their prejudices. She found herself flying with extra caution, double-checking everything, never allowing even the smallest mistake that could be used against her. Her first regular assignment was flying supplies to remote mining camps in the mountains. These were routine cargo flights that typically involved landing on dirt strips at high altitude, often in challenging weather conditions. The work was perfect training for building mountain flying experience, and Sarah excelled at it. But some of the miners and camp supervisors were not ready to see a woman pilot climbing out of the cockpit. During her second week on the job, she landed at a remote copper mine high in the San Juan Mountains to deliver critical equipment parts. The foreman, a burly man named Jake Morrison, took one look at her and shook his head. "Where's the real pilot?" he demanded, scanning the aircraft as if expecting another person to emerge. "I'm the pilot," Sarah replied calmly, beginning to unload the cargo. "These are the parts you ordered from Denver." Morrison crossed his arms and frowned. "Listen, sweetheart. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not signing for these parts unless they were delivered by a qualified pilot. This equipment is worth more than you make in a year." Sarah stopped unloading and turned to face him directly. "Mr. Morrison, I'm a commercially licensed pilot with over 900 hours of flight time. I've been flying these mountain routes for 3 weeks without incident. Your parts have been delivered safely and on time." "I don't care if you've got 10,000 hours, Morrison replied. "Women don't have the judgment for this kind of flying. What if there had been an emergency? What if the weather had turned bad?" Before Sarah could respond, one of the younger miners spoke up. "Jake, the weather was pretty rough this morning. I watched her land, and it was a perfect approach in some nasty crosswinds. I've seen plenty of pilots struggle with conditions like that." Morrison glared at his subordinate. "Since when are you an expert on flying, Rodriguez?" "My brother's a pilot in the Air Force," Rodriguez replied. "He taught me enough to recognize good flying when I see it." The confrontation was interrupted by the radio crackling to life in Sarah's aircraft. "Mountain Air Charter 23, this is Denver Center. We have an emergency medical evacuation request for your location. A worker at the Silver Creek mine has been injured and needs immediate transport to Denver General Hospital." Sarah grabbed the microphone. "Denver Center, Mountain Air Charter 23. What's the nature of the injury?" "Severe crush injury to the leg. Patient is stable but needs surgery within 2 hours. Silver Creek Mine is about 15 miles northeast of your current position." Sarah looked at Morrison. "That's your sister mine, isn't it?" Morrison nodded grimly. Silver Creek was part of the same mining operation, connected by a treacherous mountain road that took over an hour to drive in good conditions. "Mr. Morrison, I can have that injured worker in Denver in 45 minutes. An ambulance would take at least 3 hours over those mountain roads, assuming the roads are even passable." Morrison hesitated, clearly torn between his prejudice and the urgent need to help his employee. The strip at Silver Creek is even more dangerous than this one. It's shorter, higher altitude, and usually has terrible winds. "I've studied all the mountain strips in this area," Sarah replied. "I can handle it." Rodriguez stepped forward. "Jake, that's Tommy Hernandez up there. He's got 3 kids. If this lady pilot can get him to the hospital faster than driving, we've got to let her try." The urgency of the situation finally overrode Morrison's skepticism. "All right, but I'm going with you. If something goes wrong, I want to be there." Sarah quickly calculated the weight and balance. Morrison was a large man, and adding his weight to the injured worker and any medical equipment would put them close to the aircraft's limits. But it was manageable. The flight to Silver Creek took 12 minutes through winding mountain valleys. The landing strip was indeed challenging, carved into a narrow shelf on the mountainside with a steep drop-off on one side and a rock wall on the other. High winds were funneling through the valley, creating severe turbulence. Sarah set up for a short field approach, fighting the gusty winds that tried to push the Super Cub off course. Morrison gripped his seat as they dropped between the rocky walls of the canyon, the wingtips seeming to almost brush the stone formations on either side. The touchdown was firm but precise, and Sarah used every inch of the short strip to stop before the edge. As they shut down, medical personnel were already rushing toward them with a stretcher. Tommy Hernandez was conscious but in obvious pain, his leg splinted and bandaged by the mine's first aid team. "Is that really a woman pilot?" he asked weakly as they loaded him into the aircraft. "Best pilot in Colorado," Morrison replied, his earlier skepticism completely gone. "She's going to get you to Denver in record time." The return flight to Denver was a race against time and weather. A storm system was moving in from the west, and Sarah had to navigate around building thunderstorms while maintaining maximum safe speed. Morrison watched in amazement as she thread the needle between towering cumulus clouds, using updrafts and downdrafts to her advantage. "How did you learn to fly like this?" he asked over the intercom. "Practice, study, and never giving up," Sarah replied, making a slight course correction to avoid a particularly dark cloud ahead. "Mountain flying is about reading the weather, understanding the terrain, and always having a backup plan." They landed at Denver with 20 minutes to spare before the storms hit. An ambulance was waiting at the airport, and Tommy was rushed to surgery immediately. Sarah watched the ambulance disappear into traffic, feeling the satisfaction that came from knowing she had made a difference in someone's life. Morrison approached her as she was filling out the flight paperwork. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. I was wrong about women pilots. You saved Tommy's life today, and you did it with flying skills that most pilots could never match. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. That means a lot coming from you. I want you to know that you'll always be welcome at our mining operations, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows what happened here today." Over the following months, Sarah's reputation continued to grow. She successfully completed dozens of challenging flights, each one building her credibility in the aviation community. But she also faced continued resistance from those who couldn't accept that a woman could be an exceptional pilot. The real test came when Regional Airlines, a growing commuter carrier, announced they were looking for experienced mountain pilots to fly their new routes between Denver and smaller mountain communities. It was exactly the kind of opportunity Sarah had been working toward, a chance to fly larger aircraft on scheduled passenger routes. When she submitted her application, complete with glowing recommendations from Bill Harrison and several mining companies, the response was swift and predictable. "We appreciate your interest," the rejection letter read, "but our insurance company requires all pilots to have airline transport pilot licenses and at least 2,500 hours of flight time. Additionally, we feel that our passengers would be more comfortable with male pilots." Sarah stared at the letter, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and determination. She had more than enough flight time and could easily obtain her airline transport pilot license. The real barrier was the same one she had faced her entire career: prejudice disguised as company policy. But instead of being discouraged, Sarah saw this as her next challenge. If regional airlines wouldn't hire her based on her current qualifications, she would make herself so exceptionally qualified that they couldn't ignore her. She began studying for her airline transport pilot license immediately, determined to become not just good enough, but undeniably the best pilot they had ever seen. 2 years later, Sarah had accumulated over 2,000 hours of flight time and held every rating a pilot could earn, including her airline transport pilot license. She had become the most experienced mountain pilot in Colorado, with a safety record that was unmatched in the industry, yet she still couldn't get hired by any major airline. The breakthrough came on a snowy December morning when every pilot in Denver was grounded by the worst winter storm in 20 years. Winds were gusting to 70 miles per hour, visibility was near zero, and the temperature had dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. The airport had officially closed all operations, and commercial flights were canceled across the entire region. That's when the emergency call came in. Mountain Air Charter. "This is Denver Emergency Services." The radio crackled through the static. "We have a critical medical emergency at the Vail Ski Resort. A 7-year-old girl has been in a skiing accident and has severe internal injuries. She needs immediate transport to Children's Hospital in Denver for emergency surgery. But all helicopter services are grounded due to weather conditions." Bill Harrison looked out the window at the blizzard raging outside. "There's no way anyone can fly in this weather. The visibility is zero. Winds are hurricane force and the mountains will be socked in completely. The girl won't survive a ground transport," the dispatcher continued. "The roads through the mountains are closed due to avalanche danger. Flying is her only chance, but we need a pilot with exceptional mountain flying experience." Sarah had been listening to the conversation from across the hangar where she was reviewing aircraft maintenance logs. She walked over to Bill, her mind already calculating the challenges involved in such a flight. "I can do it," she said quietly. Bill stared at her in disbelief. "Sarah, this is suicide. No one has ever flown through weather like this in the mountains. The turbulence alone would tear an aircraft apart." "Maybe no one has tried," Sarah replied, already pulling weather charts and approach plates for Vail. "But that little girl is going to die if someone doesn't try." The dispatcher was still on the radio. "We've contacted every pilot in the region. Everyone has refused the flight. The conditions are beyond anything anyone is willing to attempt." Sarah took the microphone. "Denver Emergency Services, this is Sarah Mitchell with Mountain Air Charter. I'll take the flight." There was a long pause before the dispatcher responded. "Did you say Sarah Mitchell? As in the female pilot?" "That's correct. I'm instrument rated, have extensive mountain flying experience, and I'm willing to attempt the rescue." Another pause. "Ma'am, I have to tell you that 12 male pilots with thousands of hours of experience have already turned down this mission. Are you sure you understand what you're volunteering for?" Sarah felt the familiar surge of determination that had driven her entire career. "I understand perfectly. A child's life is at stake. When can we depart?" Bill grabbed her arm. "Sarah, think about this. The winds are stronger than anything you've ever flown in. The visibility is zero. The approach into Vail is dangerous even in perfect weather. In conditions like this, it's impossible." "Bill, impossible is just another word for something that hasn't been done yet," Sarah replied, beginning her pre-flight planning. "I've been preparing for a flight like this my entire career." The aircraft she would use was a specially modified Super Cub, equipped with the latest instruments for all-weather flying. It had extra fuel tanks, enhanced communications equipment, and structural modifications that allowed it to handle severe turbulence. If any aircraft could survive the storm, this was it. Word of Sarah's decision spread quickly through the Denver aviation community. Pilots gathered at the airport to watch what many believed would be a suicide mission. Some came to show support, others to witness what they expected to be a disaster. "She's going to get herself killed," one veteran pilot told a reporter who had arrived to cover the story. "No pilot, male or female, can fly in weather like this. It's not about courage, it's about physics," but others disagreed. "If anyone can do it, it's Sarah Mitchell," said Jake Morrison, the mining foreman who had become one of her strongest supporters. "I've seen her fly in conditions that would ground most pilots. She's got skills that can't be taught." As Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection, the storm continued to intensify. Snow was falling so heavily that she could barely see the wingtips of her aircraft. The wind was howling through the hangar doors, and the temperature was still dropping. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the pediatric surgeon who would accompany Sarah to treat the injured girl during the flight, looked nervous as she climbed into the passenger seat. "I have to ask, are you sure we can make it through this weather?" "Dr. Chen, I can't guarantee anything except that I'll do everything possible to get you to that little girl safely," Sarah replied. "But I need you to trust me and stay calm no matter what happens." The takeoff was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The moment they left the ground, the aircraft was caught in violent turbulence that threatened to tear the wings off. Winds were coming from multiple directions, creating a washing machine effect that tossed the Super Cub around like a toy. Sarah fought the controls constantly, making continuous adjustments to keep them airborne and on course. The instruments were spinning wildly, and outside the cockpit windows was nothing but swirling white snow. They were flying blind through one of the most dangerous weather systems ever recorded in Colorado. "I can't see anything," Dr. Chen said through gritted teeth as the aircraft bucked and rolled. "Neither can I," Sarah replied calmly. "We're flying on instruments now. The important thing is to trust the equipment and not panic." Navigation was nearly impossible. The storm was interfering with radio signals, and the GPS was giving erratic readings due to the severe turbulence. Sarah had to rely on dead reckoning and her intimate knowledge of Colorado's mountain terrain to find their way to Vail. 20 minutes into the flight, they encountered the worst turbulence Sarah had ever experienced. A massive downdraft grabbed the aircraft and slammed them toward the ground at over 3,000 feet per minute. The altimeter was unwinding so fast it looked like a clock spinning backwards. Sarah immediately applied full power and pulled back hard on the stick, but the aircraft continued to descend. According to her calculations, they were approaching the altitude of the mountain peaks, but she couldn't see anything through the blinding snow. "Are we going to crash?" Dr. Chen asked, her voice tight with fear. "Not if I can help it," Sarah replied, continuing to fight for every foot of altitude. Finally, they hit an updraft that launched them back skyward with such force that they were both pressed into their seats. Sarah used the momentum to climb back to a safe altitude, her heart pounding from the close call. The approach into Vail was even more challenging than the en route portion of the flight. The airport was completely socked in with snow and clouds, and the winds were creating severe wind shear that made a stable approach nearly impossible. Sarah made 3 attempts to land, each time being forced to go around when the winds threw them off course at the last second. On the 4th attempt, she used a technique she had never tried before. Instead of fighting the wind, she used it to help position the aircraft for landing. The touchdown was hard but safe, and as they rolled to a stop, emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. The injured girl was loaded quickly onto a medical stretcher and placed in the back of the Super Cub. "She's in critical condition," the paramedic told Dr. Chen. "You've got maybe 90 minutes before she'll need surgery." The return flight to Denver was a race against time and continuing severe weather. Sarah pushed the aircraft to its limits, using every shortcut and technique she knew to minimize flight time while still maintaining safety. As they approached Denver, the storm began to break up slightly, allowing her to make a direct approach to the airport. The landing was smooth, and the girl was immediately transferred to a waiting ambulance that rushed her to Children's Hospital. 2 hours later, Dr. Chen called with the news that the surgery had been successful. The little girl was going to make a full recovery. The story of Sarah's impossible rescue flight made national headlines. "Female pilot defies blizzard to save child," read newspapers across the country. Aviation magazines wrote detailed analyses of the flight, calling it one of the most skillful displays of flying ever recorded. More importantly, the aviation industry finally took notice. Within a week, Sarah received job offers from 3 major airlines, including regional airlines which had previously rejected her application. "We'd be honored to have you join our team," the regional airline's chief pilot told her personally. "Your skills and experience are exactly what we need for our mountain routes." But by then, Sarah had bigger dreams. The publicity from her rescue flight had caught the attention of aerospace companies developing new technologies. She was offered a position as a test pilot, working on experimental aircraft that would push the boundaries of what was possible in aviation. Standing on the same runway where she had first been doubted and dismissed, Sarah reflected on her journey. She had faced prejudice, skepticism, and challenges that would have deterred most people, but she had never given up on her dream of flying. The young woman who had once been laughed at by male pilots was now recognized as one of the finest aviators of her generation. She had proven that skill, determination, and courage mattered more than gender, and she had opened doors for countless other women who dreamed of flying. As she walked toward her new test aircraft, a sleek, experimental design that represented the future of aviation, Sarah smiled. The impossible had become possible, and the sky truly was the limit. Her story would inspire generations of female pilots who would follow in her contrails, proving that with enough determination and skill, any barrier could be overcome. The girl who had been laughed at on the runway had done far more than the impossible in the sky. She had changed the world of aviation forever.